Now let's look more closely at the pragmatic performer. This person analyzes thoroughly before reaching a conclusion. And as I said before, they tend to focus on practical solutions. This is particularly true for people who are novices in a topic area. Many of our students are young, they don't have a lot of work experience. So many of their practical solutions might be on the naive side, but as they gain greater expertise, they can arrive at even stronger conclusions. And here's the key weakness of the pragmatic performer. They tend to stop when they reach a conclusion or solution. You might ask, well, what's wrong with that? Here's the problem. A person who is operating as a pragmatic performer knows very well that whatever solution they recommend has limitations. And they can describe those limitations because they have good analysis skills. They can say, here's my recommendation, and here are their arguments against it. And those arguments against it lead to some limitations, and so on and on and on. Because they tend to focus on trying to get something done, they tend to do nothing about the limitations. And this, in turn, tends to create a real problem when you get out into the, quote, real world. I see this a lot with business managers. They make wonderful decisions, but they don't monitor how their organization is doing. They're aware of risk, and they're aware of changing circumstances, such as customer tastes changing, but they don't do anything about it. The other thing that you might see as a professor is that unless you ask questions, ask your students to give you details about their thinking, you might have trouble distinguishing between a student that has a biased jumper thinking versus pragmatic performer thinking. Both of them may present their viewpoint and stack up arguments in favor of it. So what I do in my assignment is I require students to explain how they decided what was most important. And I also require them to provide arguments on multiple sides of an issue. The biased jumper can't satisfy these requirements, whereas the pragmatic performer can. So what I do as a teacher is to prompt my students so that I can elicit more information about their thinking. There isn't a lot of research in the workplace on these patterns, but I believe that a lot of business managers operate as pragmatic performers. We see a lot of evidence of this pattern of thinking in the way that companies operate and behave. The picture that I'm showing might seem a bit confusing, but to me it represents the complexity of thinking of a pragmatic performer. They can take messy information, find logical and reasonable groupings, and they can put it all together in a way that makes sense. They have very strong critical thinking skills. So let's pause now and get a sense of how common you think this pattern is among your students or the people you work with. I'm now showing you the results of the poll. This distribution is fairly similar to the one that we looked at earlier for the perpetual analyzer. In general, the distribution is skewed toward the left, but surprisingly, 6% of you think that more than 90% of the people you're working with are operating at this stage. I assume this is for audience members who, from workplace settings, or perhaps some of you are teaching in upper-level graduate courses. I should mention that I taught one course one time in which the majority of students in my classroom were operating as pragmatic performers. It was an elective course called Cases in Cost Accounting. Doesn't that sound exciting? It was one of the easiest jobs I've ever had as a teacher. I could give these students challenging questions and they would pretty much teach themselves. But of course, one of the things I was trying to do with these students was get them moved to the next stage. So, what is the transition from pragmatic performer to pattern 4 that I call the strategic revisioner? The transition is the development of step 4 skills. The first piece of that is to recognize and be very conscious of the limitations of conclusions. As I said before, pragmatic performers are aware of limitations. They're aware of risks. So acknowledgement of limitations isn't enough. The key is in what you do about it and perhaps in monitoring those limitations. Pragmatic performers are often time-oriented. Well, I've solved this problem, now let me move on to the next one. They often resist spending time to think about and monitor limitations. The other big piece, and I'm using some fairly complex language here, is the idea of being able to use an integrated process to generate new knowledge and guide innovations over time. In other words, this is PhD level thinking. One aspect of working on a doctorate is this idea of developing a plan for how you would go about learning something over time, knowing that you will never completely know everything. That's the mindset someone needs to move past the pragmatic performer thinking to what I call strategic revisioner thinking.